Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of How to Think. And today I have a very special guest here. It's Dr. Jerry Bergman. Now, Dr. Jerry Bergman, he is one of the top 10 most educated people in the world with 1,026 college credit hours, which would be the equivalent of about 20 master's degrees. He is also a member of Mensa. He has over 1,500 scientific publications. So very glad to have him on the channel here, especially with the topic of how to think. And welcome, Dr. Bergman. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. It's good to be here. And I've got some notes I can relate. I'm talking about the nuns. And when I say that, people think the Catholic nuns, but no, the nuns is the new religion. And basically it is consists of atheists. My throat's been bothering me, so let me get this. Probably should have gotten some water here, and it tends to help. Any rate, the nuns now are the fastest growing religion in America. And the rest, let me get some water quick. Anyways, surveys have been done, quite a few surveys on how many people are members of various Christian groups. And the nuns now are the fastest growing religious cohort in the United States. They are at 28%. And they're more common now than Catholics, which is 23%, and evangelical Protestants, which is 24%. And so why is this change? Why is this increase in the nuns? And nuns basically include atheists and agnostics. And by the way, these surveys rate the nuns and atheists and agnostics as religion. So when we talk about religion, we're talking about not just Christians and Catholics and so on. We're also talking about atheists and agnostics. So when we talk about freedom of religion, we're talking about actually for every group. Okay, why are they growing? Well, one reason I'll focus on now is the educational system. And New York Times best-selling textbook used in schools and found in libraries throughout the United States is called, this is a funny title, National Geographic Kids Almanac. And I think they're trying to open doors with that title. Basically, it's a beautiful book, lots of pictures, well illustrated, very well written. And basically, where did everything come from? And I'll read from the book where everything came from. All things you see in the universe today, all the stars, galaxies, and planets, everything that now exists came from a single, incredibly hot, dense state that scientists call a singularity. And now I'm still reading. Then suddenly, the basic elements that make up the universe flash into existence. In this moment, we call the Big Bang. Now, if you think about this, things don't just pop into existence. Is this really rational? Does this really explain what happened? And they don't really attempt to explain how this could have happened. Of course, they don't know. It's a belief structure. Then the book added everything we can see or detect around us in the universe began with the Big Bang. We know the Big Bang created not only matter, but also space itself. The author then explains that the universe and everything in it will end when the stars run out of fuel. So we popped into existence, and we're going to eventually, the book claims, everything is going to end. And what they should have done, if they want to objectively present the material, is they should mention that the Big Bang violates the two fundamental laws of the universe. And if you study, physics and even high school chemistry, you learn that the law of thermodynamics, which says matter can be neither created nor destroyed by natural processes. It can only change from one form into another. Pretty obvious, pretty clear. Matter can be neither created nor destroyed by natural processes. It can only be changed from one form to another. It also violates this statement that relative to the Big Bang, also violates the cause and effect law, which says that everything that happens requires a sufficient cause. In other words, everything happens for a reason, not accidentally. We live in a very orderly universe, and of course, that's obvious if you study astronomy or even any of the sciences, and it's governed by law. Very important.
Yep.
Okay, now the enormous, well-documented problems, or sorry, nor were the enormous, well-documented problems with the Big Bang mentioned. The impression, not only this book, but others, is that the Big Bang is undisputed fact equal to gravity. Even mentioning they could have, even mentioning a few books by well-known scientists would help to balance the presentation. And in my library, I just checked and I found 6 books that discuss the problems with the Big Bang. And these 6 books were, I'll give you titles of a few of them. The Columbia University graduate, Eric Lerner, who wrote the book, The Big Bang Never Happened. And this is published by Random House. We're not talking about an out-of-the-way small publisher. It's published by a major publishing house. And the title is very clear in what the book supports. The Big Bang never happened. Another book is titled Dismantling the Big Bang by University of Australia, Professor John Hartnett, who has a PhD. He's widely published in journals, about 120 papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So his book noticed if the Big Bang actually could have happened, the only thing it can produce is expanding gas cloud, not the universe we see today. So he points out quite effectively, and of course he's got a whole book which documents this, but he points out quite effectively, we're not going to get the universe we see today from the hypothetical Big Bang, period. Now, obviously the Big Bang is widely believed. Fine, present the evidence, present that case, but also they should be objective and present the other side. Now, this book is for kids, probably I would say junior high, high school level. And the reason I selected this because this book has sold thousands and thousands of copies. It's a standard book used in many, many schools, not as necessarily as a textbook, but as supplementary reading. Okay, then they outline the kids' almanac. Now we're still in that. They outline the standard evolution of life claims. Basically, they start out with spontaneous generation of life somehow evolved into bacteria. Then, as a result of damage to the genes, of course, mutations, then more advanced life evolved until after billions of years, mankind evolved. So we're talking about going from matter to life to mankind. And again, they ignored all the problems with this picture. They didn't get into any details about the problems with abiogenesis, the spontaneous generation of life. They just kind of assume, well, it occurred, it's fact. And when I talk to students, or actually the children of students who have had this course, they say, well, that's just, it happened. That's just, science proved it. It's true, like gravity. We don't understand gravity, but we know it happened. And then there's a companion book which went into more detail. This, I guess, is for the older kids. And this I thought was interesting because they talk about the origin of 10,000 living birds. Where did birds come from? Where did they evolve from? Well, the students might think it came from some animal similar to a bird. Well, actually, the best choice they have is birds evolved from dinosaurs. And you might not think that's a very good example, but on the other hand, in fact, they're specific. Specifically, the Maniraptorian dinosaurs, including Velociraptor and Oviraptor, is the theory that they produced. The problem with that is how can and these are not huge dinosaurs, they're smaller, but they're 50 pounds. How can a 50-pound dinosaur evolve into a 0.07 ounce bird? Huge difference size-wise. The dinosaur is 11,429 times larger than a hummingbird. Well, what other choice do they have? And when they discuss this, they think about other possible choices, but evolving from a mammal, there's a problem there. And in many ways, a bird is more similar to a dinosaur than many other animals. But in many ways, of course, it is very, very different. Now, we would expect, considering dinosaurs have large bones, and we found even examples of the skin of dinosaurs now in the fossil record, we would think if that evolution occurred, we would find plenty of fossil evidence. We would find thousands of examples, but we have not one single example at all, period, that shows any evidence of a dinosaur evolving into a bird. It's just not there. And one thing I want to stress in this presentation is that present the theories, present the ideas that evolutionists have, but talk about the other side. And the only way I can describe this really is, and I've got a whole pile of books, the same thing, same problem, is this is indoctrination. They're giving young, impressionable kids ideas which they don't document, they claim are true, and kids walk away believing these things. And I've talked to a few kids and they say, well, this is where dinosaurs evolved into birds. Well, that's fact. Scientists have proved that. And of course, they don't want to volunteer evidence to show that. And now to try to bring this up to the problem we have today. The problem we have today is basically kids are indoctrinated into one worldview. And that worldview is, of course, Darwinism. The problem is, though, that Darwin's goal was specifically, and he said this, Darwin's goal was to murder God. How do you murder God? You murder God by destroying the reasons people believe in him. Done many, many surveys. And when they survey people on why they believe in God, 90% or so say, well, the evidence around us, the birds, the trees, the sky, the water, the sea, the natural world, basically, is why people believe in God. So Darwin realized this. In fact, he studied Paley in college. He had to read the whole book. He was very impressed with it. And so he realized the way you can destroy God, the only way, is to come up with another explanation for the existence of the natural world. And that explanation he came up with, of course, was evolution. If evolution explains the natural world, there's no need for God. And that's obvious in history because before Darwin, about 99.99% of the public and naturalists and so on believed in God and accepted in the Western world Christianity. After Darwin, what happened? A large number of people, scientists in particular, the vast majority, around 96, 97%, are atheists or agnostics or part of the nuns and don't believe in God. Why? Because they've accepted the alternative idea that Darwin proposed, and therefore they realized God doesn't have a job. What role does God have in the world? And therefore they've come up with a reason to reject the creation theistic explanation. Now, bringing this up to date, when just today, interestingly, when Trump talked about the anti-religion sentiment in this country, he's appointed, I forget the details, but he's appointed a couple of people to basically look into this and try to deal with the anti-religious propaganda, especially in the schools. And this is one area that I would hope he would look into, that Trump would realize that this is a major argument that atheists use to bring people to their side. And whether they do or not, I don't know. But Trump is somewhat unpredictable, I guess, in some ways. But on the other hand, I was happy to hear what he had to say. And the main argument that evolutionists have is that no, God is not religion. God is religion. Therefore, anything that supports God is, quote, teaching religion. And with the whole creation issue, what they've argued basically is that you cannot teach creation in the schools, nor can you teach against evolution, because that is teaching backdoor creation. So in essence, what you can do is teach evolution as fact. And you can also, ironically, and I've got a whole bunch of books which document this, you can ironically teach against creation, because that is teaching backdoor science, they claim. And many books are very open about this. They say that we can teach against myths. And one myth, well, creation's wrong, it's not true. Therefore, we can teach against creation because therefore what we're teaching is science. So the courts have made, and I've surveyed over 200 cases. I've written 5 books about this issue. And the 5 books involve about 200 cases. And the 200 cases, every one of them, the courts basically ruled you must teach evolution as fact. You cannot teach information against evolution because, as I said, that's backdoor teaching creation. And you cannot teach evidence for creation, nor can you teach, of course, evidence against evolution. So basically, what we have is indoctrination in our schools. And now there are a lot of teachers that don't go along with that, but you're risking your career when you start to criticize evolution. Now, some get away with it. Some I have a friend of mine, his principal is very supportive. And as long as you have no complaints, he said, I'm not going to complain. Your kids like you, you're a good teacher. So he taught evidence in favor of creation and against evolution. And I understand something like 12 or 13% of teachers actually take that approach. And so it is not unknown. But once they're found out, the Richard Dawkins organization, once they find out, they try to make sure that you're terminated. A friend of mine who is a historian and very got 3 degrees, I think, in history, a master's, a doctorate, and teaches history. And one of his lessons was to present the history of teaching, or the history of the ideas supporting the creation worldview. This he taught as a historical part of our history. Well, the Richard Dawkins Foundation found out, and of course he was terminated, which doesn't surprise those of us who have looked into this area. So this is a historian and very decorated military history he had, and he taught at a major university, I think, in Middle America. But anyways, he's terminated, and this is the hostility that you often find in this area. So to try to summarize, what we see is indoctrination in the schools today. People are indoctrinated into a worldview, and that's really what evolution is. It's a worldview. You might not want to use the word religion, so let's use the term a worldview. And that's what Christianity is. It's a worldview. Evolution's a worldview. Evolution basically answers the basic questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And where are we going? Evolution says where we come from, we evolve. Why are we here? Survival of the fittest, to survive. Where are we going? When we die, we die. That's it. The Christian and atheist and Muslim and the Christian and the related, the Muslim and so on, the theistic religion, they believe, how do we get here? We're created. Why are we here? To serve God, to serve man, to do good works, etc., to honor our Creator. Where are we going? What's the end? The end is heaven or hell. So those two worldviews answer the basic questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What's the purpose of our life? And where are we going? So you can't say that one is religious and the other is not. All three are clearly worldviews. And the ironic fact is that in the schools, they can only teach legally one worldview. That we evolved, that's how we got here. What was our purpose? To survive, survival of the fittest. Where are we going when we die? When we die, we die. That's it. That's the end of us. And so clearly you can see indoctrination going on in that worldview. Once this is brought out in a clear way, as I've tried to do, then you're far less to end up with opposition. You talk about teaching creation and the scientists go berserk. Can't do that. It's religion. It's wrong. But when you look at it more objectively, as the title of your program is, when you look at it more objectively, you can see that what they are doing is indoctrinating students in a worldview, i.e., a religion. And that is a problem. And I think once we get the door open, once they realize that, look, we're not indoctrinating, we're not teaching students what to believe, we're teaching them how to think, not what to think, but how to think. Yep. And indeed, by covering both sides in the way that I just did, you're teaching students what to think, unless you cover both sides, and how to think, and that's a problem. And therefore,
I resemble that because I was a victim of this indoctrination, and in fact, it took me about 37 years before I ever heard a positive argument for creation. Now, I might not have sought it out on my own, but why would I seek it out if all I ever heard from any educator I ever was presented to or by, I had no reason to look for it.
now
So
your background, your academic background is what?
Well, I'm in criminal justice.
Okay, well, in
And,
criminal justice, you certainly, I would
yeah,
hope, would learn to think about both sides. So, and in that area, you have to cover both sides, and that's true. But science is the same thing. There are so many issues which are they're both sides. There's two sides to the Big Bang, and students should be taught the evidence for it and the evidence against it.
yeah.
And that's
Well, and
teaching. Go ahead.
seems ridiculous to begin with, right? Because so you're telling me nothing exploded, and that's what created everything. That
Right. Yeah.
doesn't even make sense when you really think about it. But if you're just presented it by people who are supposed to be smarter than you, or supposed to be teaching you, you just kind of you accept it, and you've been hearing it from the time you were a child. So you don't have a reason to question it or think about it all that much. And that I think that's what you're talking about with it's indoctrination.
Right. It is. I'll give you one example. My grandson took biology in high school, of course, and he's a college graduate now, but he took biology in high school and he brought his book home and I looked at it. And his biology book basically gave the proof for evolution. And one of the proofs it gave was the vestigial organs. All these organs, they had no function, the appendix and the tonsils and coccyx, and then had a whole list of them. And I said, that's not true. And I gave him my book that I wrote, basically, which showed all of these structures have a function. And his dad, my stepson, basically said, "You're not going to read it. He's trying to get through school. They teach evolution. He needs to accept it to get through school. If he rejects it later on, that's his business. But we want him to do well in school and sit up and say, well, Mrs. Jones, my teacher, maybe there isn't a use for the appendix or for the tonsils or for these other structures." So she wouldn't, he never read it. And now you can see how the indoctrination is such where they realize if they want to survive, they have to accept the worldview. That's now where he's at. I don't nowadays, except he has recently found this beautiful young girl, both in the same program at the university, and she's a very clear, devout Christian. And I have a feeling that he's going to be exposed to that worldview a lot now because he's very anxious to please his fiance now. And so they both have degrees from the same school, they're same age, and they're both working at in the business field. But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean it's I mean I even took as part of my criminal justice courses, I even took what was it, anthropology. So it went all into evolution, all that. I got an A in that class. So if somebody says I don't understand evolution, well, I took a college level course on it and I did excellent in it. So I understand it. I could pass a test about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a common argument they use. They say, well, you don't really understand the Big Bang. You don't really understand evolution. The problem is we often do understand it and they don't.
Yep.
And so it's a word they use, set of words they use to try to uh, delegitimate our worldview. And that's basically what we're looking at, of course, is worldview. So, but any race, if I presented some of this to some of the evolutionists, I'm sure how they would respond is, well, you don't understand the whole issue. You need to understand how important this is. And you don't really have a good knowledge of the whole issue. And therefore, we need to help students develop a good knowledge because evolution is the basis of all of our sciences. You cannot understand biology or science without understanding evolution. It's at the core of our belief of our science. And that, of course, is just not true. But I noticed that I have 3 degrees from medical school. And if evolution was talked about in any of my courses, I would remember it very clearly. It would stick in my mind. 3 degrees, which is what, 3 years for each degree, that's 9 years I spent in college, in medical school. And if now I'm not an MD, I took courses like biochemistry and cell biology and so on, the science courses. And never, the idea of evolution was never once, ever mentioned in my 9 years of graduate work at the medical school. And so when they say the foundation of all biology is evolution, that's just not true. It's just not true at all. And
So foundation of sand, right?
It is, yeah, foundation of sand. So, any rate, go ahead.
Oh no. So yeah, that's one of the books. I think you have a few books on it, but about how evolution's impossible. And if you could talk a bit about that on some of those arguments, right? You were just talking about dinosaurs to birds. Well, how did a animal that was huge and had teeth become a feathered animal with a beak and no teeth? Like, doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. They're looking though, and they found evidence that some dinosaurs had what's appear to be, there's debate, of course, about this, but they found some evidence of some dinosaurs might have had feathers. So they're on their way of evolving into a bird. And so, and of course, some few birds, I think one or two types do have some type of teeth. So therefore, they're trying to slowly bring into the idea that indeed that's where we
I think it was
came.
Archaeopteryx was a big one that they looked at, and I think that was proven to be a fraud. I think they also found some fossils of actual birds that were quite older than even some dinosaurs. So if birds existed during the time of dinosaurs, then obviously they didn't evolve from
Yeah.
dinosaurs.
The problem is when they make these findings, it's hard to get published because if and the finding is so contradictory to evolution, they're inclined to say, well, there must be something wrong. I don't know what's wrong here, but you must have made a mistake that your conclusions are incorrect. And so you find a lot of censorship in information against evolution being presented in the journals. And so
Yeah.
that is a problem that I've had friends who had done a lot of work on radiocarbon dating, and the dating was done by certified labs. They had to pay to have it done. And the results they got, though, were not commensurate with what you'd expect in evolution. And so they never did get published. I did see the papers, though, that were completed that talked about the dates and what they found.
Yeah, censorship is a big problem. And like I said, took me 37 years to even find this information. So why isn't it just more widely presented? Why isn't more available? Like you have to look into it yourself and seek it out in order to find the information, as opposed to it just being widely presented and letting people come to their own conclusions.
Right. If you're a reader, if you read a lot, you're more apt to come up with this. And that's one, I guess, advantage or disadvantage. I always read a lot about many, many areas, including science, of course, which was my main interest. But in reading a lot, you come across a lot of this stuff. And by the way, I should mention, my grades were not always that good, but on test scores for the GRE and so on, and for graduate record exam, I always did really, really well. And I think the reason for that is because my wide reading that I did, that didn't always do that well in the course. In science course, I did pretty well, but a few courses like English, I didn't do all that well. But I found that I ended up very high scores in many of my tests that I took in order to go on to graduate school and so on. And I did extremely well. And I think that's partially because of my general reading. Also, when you read for enjoyment, it's a lot different than reading because you have to read a textbook. And so, to some degree, reading a textbook is you got to sit down, you got to read it, and there's some resistance, and your mind wanders and so on. But reading for enjoyment, you're more engaged, you're more involved, and I think in many ways you'll learn more. And I tried to read books that were not so high level academic, but were interesting. A lot of science books out there that are really well written and very interesting and didn't present a ton of facts. They presented certainly many facts, but it wasn't booked totally filled full of facts. It was a lot of information, which was interesting. And I think that helped me as well. And studies have shown, by the way, that the key to doing well in school is reading a lot, being a being a voracious reader, and that's my whole life. I just read. Talk to my wife about my library. There's about 40,000 books in my library. So, and
Oh,
I don't always read cover to cover, but some books I do. But a lot of books I read a chapter or two that's of interest, and then don't read the rest of the books. So yeah. I'm responsible for about 2 articles every week. So you do 2 articles every week and about four or 5 pages long. that's publishable, you have to spend a lot of time reading and researching related to what you're writing.
Right.
And so my
So
website,
some,
crev.info, I've got about 400 articles on there, which
oh yeah.
covers
I'll
about every subject imaginable.
I'll put all that in the description section so people can check out your work. Now,
Okay, good.
one thing I found interesting, you knew the person who got, was it prayer or the Bible removed from public education?
Oh, Madeline Murray O'Hare. Oh, yeah, she was although we got along really well. She published everything I wrote. She liked what I wrote. Very positive, but it was pretty obvious after getting to know her, she was not always a nice person. And one of the best examples was when her son left atheism, became a Christian. She said, "I'm never going to talk to him again." My thought was, he's your son. I mean, why be cordial at least to your son?
Right.
And she said very pointedly, "Look, I'm not a Christian. You guys, you have to love your enemies. I don't have to. I'm an atheist. I can hate my enemies, and I will never talk to my son again." And I understand that she never did talk to her son again when she was killed. Not, I don't know how old she remember how old she was, but when she was murdered by some atheist, by the way, who stole her money, and she was quite a wealthy woman from her atheist work. Although she used to, over and over, she sent these letters out begging for money about they're trying to survive and they're going to have to reduce the quality of the magazine if they don't get more contributions because we need more money to do quality magazine. And for 4 or 5 issues, the magazine was really poorly done. And they're trying to punish atheists, so we gave more money so they could produce a higher quality magazine, which is what they did. So I remember that. But yeah, she was an interesting person to. I've never heard a woman who sounded more like who sweared. Oh, she had the most foul mouth I've ever heard. Even on TV, she had a foul mouth. And she was a very angry woman. According to her son, she was angry because Murray was the love of her life, and he was Catholic, and he was married, and he would not leave his wife to marry Madeline. And he said it's because of religion, but I have a feeling he just no way he wanted to marry Madeline. And he found more about her. He didn't, there's no way he wanted to marry her. So, anyways, according to her son, that is when she really turned against religion because she couldn't get her man because he was Catholic and he wouldn't marry her. And so she used to go outside and look up at the sky and scream against God. "I hate you, God. I hate you." And no, said all kinds of nasty things about her creator. But anyways, that's my experience with Madeline. She died tragically. You probably know she was killed by her
Yeah.
some of her atheist friends who took her money. She had a lot of money in gold coins, and they took all those gold coins, half a million or something in gold coins or silver coins or both, and that's what they stole. And I'm not sure why they had to kill her, but well, I guess she knew who did it. And her employees actually did it. Her previous employees, but
Well, I've seen I've seen some statistics. I can't remember them precisely off the top of my head, but after they removed the Bible from school, they started teaching that humans are animals. I think it was around the 50s or 60s, somewhere around there.
yeah, around 62,
You
I
can see
think.
the statistics of, teenage pregnancy, crime, all the stuff just started to skyrocket like it increased exponentially. It's kind of like you take out a moral foundation and well, what do you expect the results to be?
Yeah, that's true. That's a problem. So, and you can see the difference between those who adhere to a Christian worldview and those who don't. There's typically a distance. Not that Christians, of course, are perfect. We know obviously many are not, but on the other hand, there's an effort to try to live up to their faith. And among the non-Christians, there really is, for many, there's no effort to live up to any faith because they don't have a faith. And so you can, well, in corrections, of course, you can see that. When I worked in the court in the probation department, you could just see most of them did not have a religious background. They might say, "What religion are you?" They'd say Catholic or whatever, but most of them did not have a religious background. No, did not have any strong relationship to a church.
Well, if you look at Hitler, I think he even started to categorize humans by how evolved they were. And
Yeah.
of course, he put Jews on the lowest tier of human evolution, to where he basically dehumanized them. He didn't even think of them as human. And that,
Very, very good point. And that's something I've been writing about for a couple of decades. I just came across a statistic which, and it's in fact, talked about Hungary. Pretty much the Hungarian Jews were left alone. Hitler had other concerns. And so there was about, I think, about 10 to 20,000 Jews in Hungary. And when the war was wrapping down, they realized that we've got maybe 2 or 3 months. Maybe we can kill all those Jews in Hungary. And so at least if we did that, we could accomplish one thing in the war. We may lose, but on the other hand, we've eliminated most of the Jews, and therefore that is an accomplishment which will be seen in history as wonderful. And so I think about 3 months, they were able to exterminate virtually all the Hungarian Jews
oh, wow.
towards the end of the war. And that is a good example where really the goal of the war was not so much conquest. The goal of the war, the main goal of the war, was to eliminate inferior races, which of course the Jews, the Slavics, and other groups, that they were going to try to produce a superior race. And as you're aware of, but I think most people are aware to some degree that Nazism was clearly based on race and superior race versus inferior race. And the Aryans were superior, of course, and everybody else was, except the Japanese. He liked the Japanese because somehow they, well, they developed a war machine very quickly and were very warlike. And so I guess he thought they might. These ideas of inferior races, of course, tend to be self-serving.
Yeah.
And I think that's one good example where, because he certainly didn't think the Mongoloid race was superior, but I guess he must have believed they were because of what the Japanese did in developing a military that was almost able to achieve a huge conquest until we got in the war and stopped.
Well, then you kind of throw in what, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, things like that, and you have quite a few deaths. A lot of
Yeah,
people
oh yeah,
died
yeah.
from atheism, right? So you'll hear the arguments, oh, the Crusades and the Inquisition. And by the way, I condemn those fully. I think they were wrong to do that. But
Yeah.
still, if you compare the amount of, I mean, you're talking millions compared to, hundreds of thousands in those few examples.
That's true. That's a good point. And one thing when you talk about this period, a lot of people say, well, that's the Nazis. They had these weird ideas. But yet the idea of inferior races was accepted pretty much throughout the entire Western world. In not only in America, but of course also in Scandinavian countries, Finland and Sweden and so on. And Finland and Sweden didn't go to the point of killing them, but this idea of inferior races was widely accepted for probably 60, 70 years. And of course, it was led, as you know, by American scientists, although the ideas began with Darwin and then with, of course, Ernst Haeckel got the ideas. And of course, he brought that into Germany. And Ernst Haeckel's people that he worked with became very convinced of evolution and racism. And that's how, of course, it spread in Nazi Germany. Although we don't know, I don't know if Haeckel ever read, I think he might have read Darwin's works. He was multilingual. But as far as we know, Hitler never read Darwin and didn't probably have the greatest respect for him because he was English, although they did feel that the English were superior race as well. And that's why Hitler was so surprised. Instead of joining the cause, they fought against him, and he never expected that. So he thought, well, they're Aryans like we are, so therefore join the cause.
Now, so what are your recent works? I think you're working on a book or two, and what's kind of your focus right now?
Well, I have several books which I'm trying to get published. The problem we have is that number one, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of creation groups that publish a lot of books, and number two, we don't have as many readers today as we used to. My early books that I wrote, the book on Hitler, for example, that sold probably 50,000 copies. So that did really well. But now it's harder to sell books because there's a lot of competition, because young people are less likely to read. They're more likely to get their information on podcasts like this.
Right.
And that's an important way of getting your information out to the public. And thirdly, they're expensive. Often to mail my books costs more than the cost to print the books.
Mm.
So I just mailed actually several books the other day, and it was $6 a book to mail each book. And the printing is not, it may surprise people, but the printing is not necessarily the major cost of a book. The major cost is they've got to be shipped from the printer to the distributor to my house to somewhere else. So the same book may be mailed 3 or 4 times. And so all of that figures in the cost of the book. Although I sell most of my books for cost, so I do pretty good. The key is I need to get into churches that are supportive. And when I do that, usually I do really well. But so many churches are not supportive. Every year I go to Chicago, and there's a big church there. I do a presentation, and I mention why I'm there. Well, gee, there must be lots of churches in Chicago that are supportive of my ministry, and likewise ministries. And we've never been able to get me into another church in Chicago.
Mm.
And the same thing is true in Pittsburgh. They brought me in Pittsburgh, and I did a radio show and TV show, and they paid all my expenses. And I thought, well, gee, while I'm there, it's a 4-hour drive. While I'm there, maybe you can get me into a church. And Sunday was free. So I was there committed to Friday and Saturday, but Sunday I was free. So maybe they can get me into a church. And they said, no, just none accepted. None wanted a speaker.
Yeah.
And the person I'm working with said, it doesn't surprise me because we bring creation in about every other month to do a TV show. And we typically don't get any of them into any of the churches. And so the churches, by and large, are often closed. And I think this is tragic because, number one, they say it's controversial. I wish it was controversial. I did manage to get into about 400 churches, some many times the same church, but been in about 400 churches and zero controversy, none. When I'm done with my presentation, good sermon, I loved it, good information, thank you for coming, see you later, and I left. Except one exception, really good church, Methodist church, by the way, and they warned me when I came that there's this lawyer, smart guy, he doesn't agree with the creation idea. So they warned me. And so I did my presentation and had my book table and sold lots of books. And finally, this guy came up, and I figured, bright person, obviously, had a lot of good questions. He was the lawyer, and I've never had such a good time talking to somebody as one of my opposers.
Yeah.
And I don't remember how long we were there, but when we left, there was 2 cars in the parking lot left, mine and his. And so I bet we talked for an hour and a half or so, and we had the best conversation. And he was reasonable. You could talk to him.
Yeah.
And I think I helped him realize what our message was and why it was important. But like I say, I wish there was more controversy. I wish somebody would say, no, wait a minute. I heard your message, and let me tell you, I disagree with this. Good. What did you disagree with? Let's talk about it. And so the problem is it's not controversial. And also, I think a lot of pastors feel the purpose of a message is to read from the Bible, the missionary trips of Paul. And they ignore the fact that God has 2 revelations. One is his word, and the second is his works. And the simple fact is that his works are often ignored, even though there's many scriptures in the Bible that talk about his works. And historically, if you went to a seminary probably before 1700, you would read about his works and his word. And his works was called natural theology. And you go to a bookstore, look at old books titled Natural Theology, you open it up, and the book is about botany or chemistry or physics. And so they saw this as natural theology. And so in the olden days, when you went to seminary, half your courses would be in science. And this is why all the early scientists in Darwin's day, for example, all the early scientists were trained as ministers. And that's how we criticize Darwin to some degree, because his only degree was in theology. Well, yeah, his only degree was in theology, but he studied a lot of science to get that degree. Back then they did. Nowadays, I'm not aware of any seminary that covers not just the Bible and Greek and Hebrew and so on, but I'm not aware of any seminary that has a course in natural theology. But I think they should. They should cover God's creation. I've got a
You
whole book on this,
mentioned,
by the way. Many people, the the doorway to the creator is studying the natural world. And these were in the book. Most of them were atheists or agnostics, and they became creationists and Christians through studying the natural world. When you study the natural world, you realize that it screams of intelligent design, it screams of a creator. And therefore, for every one of the book, and there's many, it's just I selected some well-known examples. And every one in my book, basically, they came to God through Christ through studying the natural world. And you get this when you work with students. For example, at the medical school, one of the courses I took dealt with the eye. And to see the lens of the eye under a microscope, I'll never forget that. Beautiful picture. It was made out of cells. All your body's, of course, made out of cells, with few exceptions. And the eye is made out of cells. Well, it has to be transparent, not just the lens, which is what I was referring to, but the eye has to be transparent. Well, how do you get a cell from a cell which has a nucleus and all the parts of the cell? How do you get that to become transparent? Well, you can see they're clearly cells that make up the lens, but they had all the cellular parts were removed. They were taken out so that the lens would be clear. And of course, it still has to have nutrients, and the nutrients flow through channels, which you can see in the lens. And when you study medicine, especially I didn't study medicine to treat patients, but I studied medicine to understand the biochemistry and anatomy of the body. And when you study that, you can realize how well designed it is. I remember we had one lecture on the hyoid bone. Simplest bone in the body, looks like a U, hyoid bone. And we had, I bet, half an hour on the hyoid bone and how well designed that is and how important that was. Without that, you would have a big problem. You connect to the tongue, and therefore your tongue wouldn't work right if you didn't have that bone. But anyways, the professor at the end, I remember, and several students remember, he said, whoever designed this sure knew what he was doing. That's all he said. And we picked it up that indeed it was really well designed. And although when you look at it, it's a U, it's a simple U, but the whole design of the system that hyoid bone is connected to is amazing.
and that kind of goes into irreducible complexity, which was supposed to disprove. I think Darwin mentioned that himself, right? If they could find some structure that couldn't be explained because it was too
Yeah,
complex, then that would basically disprove his entire theory. Well, I think the eye is a good example of irreducible complexity.
yeah, it is. Well, the whole body is, of course. And to me, I debated a atheist on that question, and I use the example of carbon 12. Well, carbon 12, to be carbon 12, it's got to have 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons, period. If you change anything, if you have one less neutron, one less proton, one less anything, you don't have carbon 12. And they could not answer that, but they made fun of it. They said all the elements are irreducibly complex. They say, well, you'll have an isotope well, yeah, you'll have an isotope, but you won't have an atom. You'll have an isotope. So you can't change the number of 666, period. If you do, you can change it, but you have an isotope. You don't have an atom anymore. Atoms are by nature, they're neutral. Now, therefore, you have an isotope.
That's amazing. And yeah, so I think evolution is intelligent design is interesting too, because we naturally know when something is designed, right? So if you just saw a regular mountain face versus Mount Rushmore, you would understand that Mount Rushmore required an intelligence to look the way that it looks. You would not think that wind and erosion and rain and all of that caused those faces to be there. And so if we look into creation, we look into biology, it's obvious that things are designed.
Yeah, that's true. It's very obvious to us, but as the scriptures talk about, they're blinded. People are blinded. The evidence is all around them, and yet they are blinded by the evidence. And they even evolutionists, when I was taking some of my coursework at another university, they would say this is wonderfully designed. Evolution is just wonderful. I go to tears to think about what evolution has done. It's just wonderful what it's done. Well, evolution is replaced God. Instead of saying God did this, they say evolution did this. And over, when you read the literature, you realize if you just take the word evolution out, you could put the word God in, and the sentence or paragraph will make sense. But of course, they don't want to do that. They want their God is evolution, and that's what they attribute all the wonders around us is with evolution.
And
Oh,
then
one work I did at the
evolution,
medical school was when I was on the staff. We did research on cancer. And cancer, of course, is caused by mutations. And we know an enormous amount about mutations because, well, that's what causes cancer. In fact, now they try to diagnose cancer according to the mutation that caused it. So if they find out the mutation, for example, in a P53, which is part of a cell division system, if they basically take that gene and analyze it, they find the vast majority of mutations occur in what they call a hotspot. And that's a big problem for evolution because when you have mutations, you have them over and over and over in pretty much the same spot. And therefore, you'll never get the variety you need to change the gene into another gene. All you'll get is basically damage to the gene because the mutations occur in one or two different, some are three different areas, but P53 is primarily in one area. And P53 is an important system, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. P53 is a system where if it checks out the cell, and if the cell is okay, it allows it to divide. If the cell is not okay, if it finds evidence of damage, then it repairs the damage, fixes it, and then the cell divides. And if P53 finds the damage is too great, P53 basically triggers apoptosis. That's not the correct pronunciation, but that's what we like to use because basically the cell self-destructs, and so it destroys the cell if it can't be repaired. And so you have this system basically which ensures that the vast majority of cells are not cancerous. Well, if P53 is damaged, guess what happens? Virtually in a large number of cases, you end up with cancer. In fact, of all cancers, the P53 is damaged in about half the cases. And so therefore, P53 is critically important. And so we know a lot about mutations, and we know that you will never get evolution by mutations. It's impossible. It's not going to work. And that was pretty obvious when I worked in cancer research at the medical school, but it's hard to go from there, not really that hard, but there's an emotional block going from there to evolution that theory is that we're made out of mutations that were caused by X-rays or radiation or some type of mutagen.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you can add any amount, any length of time in the world you want to add to that. It's not going to help. Like time doesn't even solve the issue. Now they need the time because we can't observe evolution happening. So it's kind of their cop out. But even with time, mutations they're bad. They prevent survival. They are almost always negative, right?
Yeah, well, a lot of them are near neutral, which means by themselves they don't cause a problem. But they add up, and then you end up with, of course, what they call genetic catastrophe, and that's what causes aging is near neutral mutations. They add up, and we age. And when we pass away, it's not because of one cause; it's because of a lot. When my aunt died, I asked the doctor what she died of, and on the death certificate it said myocardial infarction. So I asked him, well, what happened? Because as far as I know, she'd never been to the hospital except to have her son, my cousin. So the doctor said, well, actually, she died of everything. And I said, well, how do you mean? How could she die of everything? Well, her lungs weren't as good, her kidneys weren't working as well, her brain wasn't working as well. She basically had failure of basically every organ system. And finally, you end up with genetic catastrophe, and she died. And so we just write down on the death certificate myocardial infarction because, well, there's not enough room on the death certificate to mention, well, her liver wasn't sufficient as it should be, and her bladder wasn't, and kidneys weren't, and so on. So we just write down myocardial infarction. And by writing that down, that basically means finally her heart stopped. But her heart didn't stop because of the heart itself, stopped because the damage to the whole body was such where the heart could no longer sustain a body which was too damaged, and that's a result of aging. And so species age just like people age. And if evolution was true, we would go the other way. We get better and better as we accumulate mutations, and we wouldn't age. We wouldn't go downhill. We'd go uphill, which would be nice if it did. We'd get younger with each year we lived, but that doesn't work that way, and that doesn't work that way with species. They don't get younger. They don't evolve. They deteriorate. And although the system is designed in such a way to where they deteriorate relatively slowly. Each individual species, of course, has a lifetime, but when they have an offspring, typically the offspring has comparatively few mutations in the whole body system.
Sounds like it fits with the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
Law of entropy. As we break down. Well, yeah, I know you mentioned that you had about an hour, so we're about out of time. So just thank you very much for being on. Maybe I can have you on again.
Okay.
And what
Good talking to you.
I'll go ahead and put your website for your books and your website. I'll put all the links here into the description for people to check out your work. I really encourage people to read it, to check it out. You have a ton of great information, and yeah, thank you so much.
By the
Dr.
way,
Berg.
if you don't want to pay the regular price, if you look at eBay, there are hundreds of my books on eBay from $1 to $50. So just check eBay, or also there's addall.com, ADDALL.com, and they have probably 100 or so of my books. So you can save some money and buy them by less money.
Awesome.
So,
Thank you so much for that tip, Dr. Bergman. And
okay.
God bless you. Great to have you on, and we will see you the next time.
Okay, good to be on. Thank you.